Hello again. Today we're going to jump into 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 39 as we continue our study through what does Scripture teach about divorce and remarriage. How do we apply it to our lives today? So just to review, there's been a couple of previous videos posted about what's going on in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10 through 11, and also verse 15. As we looked at those verses 10 through 11, they seemed like they would be absolute prohibitions at first, but once we looked closer, we realized that wasn't exactly what was going on there. And then also, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15, we saw in looking there that it seems like Paul is giving permission for the innocent spouse or the deserted spouse to be free, that is, free to remarry in the case of being abandoned by an unbelieving spouse. So just for the sake of the flow of context, it'll be really valuable to have those two conclusions in the back of our mind as we look at this passage today, because it'll need to not stand in contradiction to what Paul has said elsewhere. That'll help frame what we take away from it. So let's look at it together. Verse 39 says this: "A wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if her husband is dead, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord." So as we read that at first, it sounds universally prohibitive, right? Like it's prohibiting all remarriage except for the case where the death of the spouse has taken place. But we should be careful because we have Egyptian marriage papyri, a marriage contract from the 1st century BC. So in a similar time period, in a culture is also influenced by Greek culture and one that was neighboring to Israelite culture. And in this marriage document, we see that almost identical phrasing to what Paul used is used for the Egyptian document. So much so that saying that a man may not take another wife in addition to the wife he's entering into contract with, so long as this wife is alive. And that might be like no big deal, right? But what gets really interesting is that we know as a historical fact that remarriage was permitted in the case of a legitimate divorce in Egyptian culture at this time. So we have someone speaking in the Egyptian case in a way that seems universally prohibitive, but we know from historical data, well, wait, remarriage was permitted after a legitimate divorce. So even though it sounds universally prohibitive to us, that's not actually what they were hoping to communicate. And so there's reason then, based on the chronological and geographical similarity between that document and the culture that Paul is working within, that there could be some strong similarity there too, right? That even though Paul is sounding like he's making a universal prohibition, in actuality, it might just be common with the way people were speaking at the time, and it sounds like universal prohibition to us, but really they knew it wasn't universally prohibiting all cases, but maybe only a subset or most cases. And this comes into the surface more. We can see this happening here because remember when we looked at Romans chapter 7 verses 1 through 4, that also appeared absolute on the first reading. But when we looked closer about what certain words had to have meant within that passage, we saw, oh wait, this actually doesn't prohibit all remarriage like we thought it did, or all remarriage in the cases where both spouses are alive. And importantly too, we saw when we looked into Romans chapter 7, those verses, that in the case of a legitimate divorce, two people that were previously considered to be husband and wife are no longer referred to as the husband or the wife of one another, right? So in this case, in this 1 Corinthians chapter 7 passage in verse 39, when it's referring to the husband of a woman, if they had already gone through a legitimate divorce, he wouldn't be her husband anymore, right? So again, we have more reason, a third reason perhaps, to consider that what seems like a universal prohibition in verse 39 is really referring to cases outside of situations where a legitimate divorce has already taken place. Because again, if a legitimate divorce had already taken place, this wouldn't be referring to a husband and wife any longer, at least not based on what we've seen before. And so these are really key considerations to make us think, okay, wait, there must be something else going on here. Otherwise, we're running the danger of entering into a contradiction or making Paul say something that he wouldn't be understood to be saying at the time. And so once we see that, we still have one half of the challenge remaining, right? So we have these undercutting reasons for the claim that Paul is making universal prohibition. So we can see, okay, we have a few good reasons to think that's probably not what he's saying. But then what would he be saying, right? So just to reread the passage for us, it says, a wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. And so, again, if her husband dies, again, if they were already divorced in a legitimate way, he wouldn't be her husband, right? So this is a different type of situation. This is a couple where a legitimate divorce has not taken place. But also, what Paul would just be saying then is that death, in addition to legitimate divorce, also ends the marital union. So that if a husband dies, a wife is no longer obligated to uphold her marital vows to him or to his family. And to us in contemporary Western society, it's like, man, that's almost irrelevant. That's so obvious. But it wasn't the case then, right? There was the common practice of levirate marriages. And so Paul would be basically doing away with this practice by saying, once once one of the spouses dies, the obligation of their living spouse is completed, right? They don't have to seek to ensure their progeny or anything like that. And so Paul would be doing away with this practice. But also then, just want to notice that Paul is not saying, but only if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, right? So we would actually have to be adding in something to what he is saying if we try to make this into a true universal prohibition. So in conclusion then, we have these reasons for seeing that a universal prohibition isn't what's taking place here. And what Paul is doing instead is just saying that death does end the obligations of the marital vows. And this would be relevant to his hearers at the time, even though it might seem strange to us now, because this wasn't something that was universally understood. So if you see something in here that you think is an error, I'd love to hear from you, to continue interacting with you and get close to the truth together. Because above all, that's just what I'm hoping to do. But may God bless you guys. Thanks for your time. And I'll be looking forward to hearing your thoughts here soon.